everyone. Welcome to disaster readiness and risk reduction. We are already at our finals week. So for to start off our finals week, we are already at our 13th week. So for week 13, our topic is about exposure and vulnerability. So for this week, we will explain the definition of exposure based on the SDR terminology and explain the meaning of vulnerability, capacity, and resilience within the context of disaster. So let us proceed to our discussion for exposure and vulnerability. Excuse me. So the UNISDR defines exposure as people, property, systems, or other elements present in hazard zones. They are thereby subject to potential loss, and the term susceptibility is often used to indicate that an element is exposed to a hazard. So there are three essential components for exposure. So what are these? We have the first one, people, property, systems, and other elements. Exposure involves specific elements which we must be able to identify and give a name to. Elements may be tangible or intangible as well. The second essential component is present in excuse present in hazard zones. Elements should be located within an area and duration of time during which a specific hazard event or a set of hazard events can occur. And the last essential component that we have is that there are thereby subject to potential loss. Elements should have value or importance assigned to them for it to be subject to potential loss. So this is exposure uh, essential components and these are subject to potential loss. So yung mga na-expose, alam naman natin yun, napakadaling intindihin. They are, ang exposure, ito yung mga elements na exposed to a hazard or nanganganib sa isang potential accident or hazard. So for vulnerability, vulnerability describes the characteristics and circumstances of a community, system, or asset that make it susceptible to damaging effects of a hazard. There are many aspects of vulnerability arising from various physical, social, economic, and environmental factors. So, ano nga yung mga examples of I'm sorry, examples of vulnerability. So we have poor design and construction of buildings, also inadequate protection of assets, lack of public information and awareness, limited official recognition of risk and preparedness measures, and disregard for wise environmental management. So itong mga to, these are the examples of uh, characteristics or circumstances that may make it susceptible to damaging effects of hazard or ito yung sinasabi nating vulnerability or posibleng pagmulan ng mga hazards or accidents. So vulnerability varies significantly within a community and over time. This definition identifies vulnerability as a characteristic of the element of interest. It may be community, system, or asset, which is independent of its exposure. However, in common use, the word is often used more broadly to include the element's exposure. Excuse me. So, na-discuss natin yung examples. Now, let's go on to the four main types of vulnerability. So, the first one is physical vulnerability, and it may be determined by aspects such as population, density levels, remoteness of a settlement, the site, design, and materials used for critical infrastructure and for housing. So, example, we have wooden homes and they are likely to collapse in an earthquake but are more vulnerable to fire. So, siguro familiar naman tayo dun sa mga physical vulnerability hazards. So, Katulad nun 'pag may, ang bahay is gawa sa kahoy, so, it is very vulnerable to fire. The next one is social vulnerability. So it refers to the inability of people, organizations, and societies to withstand adverse impacts to hazards due to characteristics inherent in social interactions, institutions, and systems of cultural values. It is linked to the level of well being of individuals, communities, and society. It includes aspects related to levels of literacy, education, the existence of peace and security, access to basic human rights systems of good governance, social equity, positive traditional values, custom and ideological beliefs, and overall collective organizational system. So example for this one, for social vulnerability, when flooding occurs, some citizens such as children, elderly, and differently able may be unable to protect themselves or evacuate if necessary. So this is an example of social vulnerability. Sorry sa pag ano ko, medyo ano lang yung ano ko. Sorry sa pag cough cough. Economic vulnerability. The level of vulnerability is highly dependent upon the economic status of individuals, communities, and nations. The poor are usually more vulnerable to disasters because they lack the resources to build sturdy structures and put other engineering measures in place to protect themselves from being negatively impacted by disasters. So example that we have is poor families that may live in squatter settlements because they cannot afford to live in safer areas. And the last one is environmental vulnerability. So for this one, natural resource depletion and resource degradation are key aspects of environmental vulnerability. So example of this one we have is wetlands such as Caroni Swamp are sensitive to increasing salinity from seawater and pollution from stormwater runoff containing agricultural chemicals, eroded soils, and so on and so forth. So once again, these are the main types of vulnerability. We have the physical vulnerability, social vulnerability, economic vulnerability, and environmental vulnerability. Next that we are going to discuss is about capacity, and capacity refers to all the strengths, attributes, and resources available within a community, organization, or society to manage and reduce disaster risk and strengthen resilience. So it is the central to reducing disaster risk and therefore critical to meeting development objectives. Disaster risk reduction requires an all of society engagement and partnership and also requires empowerment and inclusive, accessible, and non-discriminatory participation. So let's go on to the household level. So at the household level, capacities are often internal to communities because meaning that the people have more control over them. Rather than attempting to reduce vulnerability, building capacity may therefore be an easier strategy for individuals, since many of drivers are of vulnerability are not influenced by households, excuse me, but instead by economic and political conditions. In many low and middle income countries, the impacts of regular disasters are often observed by low income households, thereby maintaining and increasing poverty and undermining development outcomes. Enhancing capacity offers vulnerable communities the opportunity to reduce their disaster risk, develop, and adapt to climate change. So, this is for capacity. Uh, Now, we also have the disaster resilience, and it is the ability of individuals, communities, organizations, and states to adapt to recover from hazards, shocks, or stresses without compromising long-term prospects for development. So, disaster resilience is determined by the degree to which individuals or communities and public and private organizations are capable of organizing themselves to learn from past disasters and reduce the risk to future ones at international, regional, national, and local levels. Disaster resilience, take note, is a part of the broader concept of resilience or the ability of individuals, communities, and states and their institution to absorb and recover from shocks, whilst positively adapting and transforming their structures and means for living in the face of long-term changes and uncertainty. So itong disaster resilience, ito yung nasalanta sila pero they will be they are able to adapt and recover from uh, the the situation that happened to them. So, merong core elements ang disaster resilience. So, we have here context, disturbance, capacity to respond, and reaction. So, for context, this core element is whose resilience is being built, such as social group, like socio-economic or political system, environmental context, or institution. For disturbance, what shocks and or stresses like the source degradation, urbanization, or climate change that the group aims to be resilient to. For capacity to respond, it is the ability of a system or process to deal with a shock or stress depends on exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity to a disturbance or moderate damage, take advantage of opportunities, and cope with the consequences. And the last one is reaction. And reaction is a range of responses that are possible, including bounce back better, where capacities are enhanced, exposures are reduced, and the system is more able to deal with future shocks and stresses. Bounce back, where pre-existing conditions prevail, or recover but worse than before, meaning capacities are reduced. In the worst case scenario, the system collapses, leading to a catastrophic reduction in capacity to cope with the future. So these are the core elements of disaster resilience. So once again, we have context, disturbance, capacity to respond, and reaction. We also need to discuss what is risk or disaster risk. Of course, risk is the potential or disaster losses which could occur to a particular community or a society over some specified future time period. It considers the probability of harmful consequences or expected losses resulting from interactions between natural or human-induced hazards and vulnerable conditions. So there are different ways of dealing with risk. We have risk acceptance. For risk acceptance, it is an informed decision to accept the possible consequences and likelihood of a particular risk. For risk avoidance, it is an informed decision to avoid involvement in activities leading to risk realization. And risk reduction refers to the application of appropriate techniques to reduce the likelihood of risk occurrence and its consequences. For risk transfer, it involves shifting of the burden of risk to another party. One of the most common forms of risk transfer is insurance. So for your references per lesson, we have disaster readiness and risk reduction from CHED, written by Bautista. And for your activity, we have activity 1 and activity 2. But no need to do activity 2, just answer activity 1. So once again, this slideshow presentation was prepared by Sir Jemuel Anthony Garcia. So I will just present to you a short video regarding about our 13th week lesson.
High in the mountains lives Maria. A few kilometers down, at the seashore, lives Tomás. Even though they live in very different places, Tomás and Maria want to know how to adapt to climate change effects. Let's imagine that as a consequence of a temperature increase, the ocean level rises and the seashore has to face a terrible flood. Who is more exposed to it? Because of their closeness to the sea, Tomás' family is more exposed. Tomas' family is larger: his wife, their 5 children, both grandparents, and him, all living in the same seashore home. Meanwhile, at the Stilt house, Maria's family is small. She lives with her husband and 2 children. Tomas' family has a bicycle, and Maria's has a car. Tomas' family has some money, and Maria's has a savings account, a credit card, and even a cell phone. Which family is less capable of adapting if flooding occurs? Tomas' family. Their circumstances do not allow them to react to the flood as well as Maria's, which has more budget, a car to allow them to escape faster, and a cell phone that would allow them to receive an alert prior to the events, so they can react on a timely manner. The sum of all these elements allows us to identify vulnerability. Which family is more vulnerable to the flood? Tomas' family again. They are more vulnerable because their potential impact is greater and they have fewer elements to respond correctly to the flood.
So that is for our short video discussion. So once again, for week 13, only answer activity 1 for disaster readiness and risk reduction. So this PowerPoint presentation was prepared by Sir Jemuel Anthony O. Garcia. Thank you, Sir Jemuel. And see you again on our 14th week discussion. So thank you, everyone, and God bless.